new faces today, which I'm excited about. We love to engage and network here at Launchpad. So those of you who are new and don't know much about what we do here at Launchpad, so we are a technology commercialization incubator, and that basically means we help anybody that has a technology startup at any really phase of development that's trying to commercialize their idea. So we help them to identify next steps for business growth, gaps that they might have, and then infuse resources. And as part of that, we created Series24, which is an educational platform leveraging our local experts to help us learn about some of the probably most prominent topics that we've come across in our time here at Launchpad for our various startups. And we do have quite a few actual medical device startups here, so FDA was a topic that was really important to us. So that's why we wanted to bring that to you today. So I'm very glad that you've joined us. So just the way that this flows, again, for those of you who don't know, it's very conversational. So I do have some questions for our panelists, but there will be time at the end for you to interact with them. So please, if you have some questions, write them down. We'll make sure we save a few minutes for you to ask those questions. So as always, we'll get started with brief introductions. So we have Carla Wiese, who's Principal Medical Research Scientist at NAMSA. A little bit about Carla. Prior to working at NAMSA, she was at the FDA serving as lead reviewer and engineering consultant in the division of cardiovascular devices for 3.5 years and the program lead for early feasibility studies program for the last 1.5 years of her time there. She also worked as a research and development engineer in industry for over a decade in both large company and startups. So thank you for being here. And we have next to her Gary Smith, who is the CEO of VentureMed, which is one of the startups here locally that's affiliated with the ProMedica Incubator. As the Chief Executive Officer of VentureMed Group, Gary brings 30 years of business leadership experience in the medical device, equipment, and diagnostics industry to the company. He has successfully led 3 medical device startups from concept through market entry to sales growth. That is no easy feat, by the way. Prior to joining VentureMed, he has served as Chief Executive Officer of Prognostics and Clevex, both spin-outs from the Cleveland Clinic Innovation. So thank you, Gary, for being here. And then last but certainly not least, we have Paul Erhardt, who is a distinguished university professor here at UT and also the director for the Center for Drug Design and Development, PharmaMed/Biochem. It's quite the title, but here at universities we have typically very long titles. So thank you, Paul, for joining us. Paul is, as I said, a distinguished university professor of medicinal chemistry. For the last 20 years, he has served as the director for UT's Center for Drug Design and Development. We also call that CD3. Well ahead of its time, the CD3 was one of the earliest of such academic-based centers that has recently become so popular across the U.S. Prior to joining UT, Paul worked within the pharmaceutical industry, initially for about 10 years in small pharma, where he is recognized for the design, synthesis, and chemical development of a drug that became marketed and is still saving lives today. Thank you for that. And then secondly, in big pharma for about another 10 years, where he gradually rose to upper-level management within R&D. So as you can see, we have probably some of the best experts around to help introduce all of you to the FDA today. So first, I just want to thank them for being here. Thank you. Are we ready? Yeah? Okay. So starting with Carla. The FDA process is often misunderstood, as are the various meanings behind various classification and regulatory pathways. So as a former employee of the FDA, can you please give us a broad overview of the FDA and the various classifications and regulatory pathways for medical devices?
Sure. I'll try to keep this brief and as least confusing as possible. The FDA there's 3 main centers that do the reviews of new technologies. One is the Center for Drugs, one's the Center for Medical Devices, and another is the Center for Biologics. So those are sort of the big buckets. And then each one of those centers is subdivided into different divisions. And those divisions are specialized in certain therapeutic areas. And each division is again subdivided into further specialties. So whatever your device or your drug or biologic is, will get assigned to a review team in an appropriate place based on the therapy and the indication for the technology. So that's how it works, as a broad overview. My background is in medical devices, so I'll talk about the device piece of this. If you have a medical device that will be classified into one of three buckets. There's class 1, class 2, and class 3. Class 1 is for medical devices that have the least amount of risk associated with them. So you can think of something like a pill dispenser, right? It's considered a medical device. There's low risk associated with it. And that's typically in the class 1. Class 2 device is there's moderate risk associated with it, so it might be something like a guide wire or a catheter. And then class 3 devices are high-risk devices. So at the FDA consider these devices those that there's a life risk or a limb risk associated with its use. So those are the three general categories of what your device may be classified as. And then your regulatory pathway depends on that classification, as well as the knowledge that exists about the technology that you have. So if your device is class 1, which is very, very low risk, you may not actually have to go to the FDA with what's called a pre-market package and demonstrate your testing to them. You may have to only have appropriate labeling, follow good manufacturing processes, and be registered. On the other hand, if you're in class 2, which is the moderate risk category, you may be asked to demonstrate that your device is substantially equivalent to some others out there. So there's lots of catheters out there. So you would submit a package, which is called a 510K, where you show, hey, our device performs just as well as this existing device. If your device is moderate risk, but it's actually novel technology or an intended use that's different, then you may have to follow a regulatory pathway called de novo. And that's notable because the review timeline and the cost associated with that is significantly more than the 510K pathway, where you can just compare yourself to another product. So that's why I'm kind of mentioning that specifically. And then if you're class 3, your regulatory pathway is likely to be a PMA pathway. Frequently, a clinical trial is required and associated with these. Sometimes clinical trials are associated with class 2 devices, but frequently not. And the rigor associated with the review is much more, and you will be audited as part of that process. And there's a couple subdivisions within these. For example, in HDE is a humanitarian device exemption, which is appropriate if your device and the intended use is for a patient population that is very, very small. So I hope that wasn't too complicated.
No, I mean, it's a lot of information, but I think you delivered it very well. It certainly helps people understand things. I think a lot of people, at least I did before I got into this world, think like, oh, FDA means $100 million in 10 years. And if you have this FDA sticker, that means that it's gone through all of these trials. And that's not always the case. I think it's important to kind of bring that knowledge out there, that there is this different tier process out there. So, did you guys have anything that you wanted to add to that based on your experience, or?
That's a very, very thorough explanation of the FDA as an enterprise, and certainly the processes.
Yeah. All right. So, Gary, we'll move on to your first question. So, as an entrepreneur who has successfully brought several medical devices through the FDA process, can you give us a brief overview of the process, kind of that you went through, touch on your experiences, and just kind of share what that was like?
Sure, yeah, sure. And hopefully it's some helpful nuggets here. But most of my experience has been in medical device and or diagnostics in the 30 years that I've been in the business, mostly with class 2 devices and class 3 devices. And as Carla just explained, the level of risk to the patient outcome with class 2 and class 3 is slightly different. Class 3 being a traumatic outcome as a result of a failure of that product, class 2 being less so. VentureMed is a commercial stage medical device company, recently closing a Series B round, and we're in an expansion mode, ramping up our sales and marketing enterprise at this time. Our platform technology is called Flex, and Flex is a peripheral catheter for the treatment of atherosclerotic disease in the femoral arteries, the popliteal arteries, the arteries below the knee, AV access, and people that are undergoing dialysis that have AV fistula or AV grafts. We manage those disease areas as well. And the reason I share that with you is the process of of defining your regulatory strategy and of going through the motion starts on day one with a medical device company. The very first time, and I'm very fortunate to work with John Piggott, vascular surgeon from the Job Center, is the founder of VentureMed. He's been very interactive in the development of the product and the commercialization of the platform going forward. But from the first day, John and I sat down and just started to describe where we were going to go with the product. We incorporated what our FDA strategy was going to be. And the reason I say that's so important because it will drive your decisions around the claims you make for your product. What are you going to tell the FDA? What are you going to tell the world my product does? And as soon as you start to decide that, you start to think about what am I going to have to do to back that up? Because the FDA process is going to pull you through proving that your claims, whether they're therapeutic or diagnostic claims, are substantiated by the testing that you do and the rigor that you take your product line through. And so that's very much the fiber of the company right from day one. It's not a line item somewhere down in your Gantt chart as you put a project plan together. While it is definable there and there's a set of time that you put to that and there's money that you set aside to go through these tasks, it really does drive your decisions. It also drives your decisions around packaging, around labeling, again, the instructions for use that you're going to put in your product, and that's why I think it's really, really important for you to bring that discussion up in the very first meeting you have when you're thinking about starting a medical device company. I'll say that there's 5 easy steps to getting a product through the FDA, and there's a ton of stuff behind this, and Carla will get a kick out of this. So the first one is confirm that you have a medical device. I mean, you don't always have a medical device. You don't necessarily need to take some technologies through the FDA. Confirm that you have a medical device and then figure out what classification it falls under. You can go to the FDA's website and try and figure that out, or you can call 1-800-NAMSA and get someone on the phone from NAMSA that has been doing this for a long time that can help you out, or you can contact someone like me that's been in the industry and understands the divisions between 2, 3, and Class 1. But it's really important to understand that on the front end. And Carla mentioned as well, find a predicate device. And the predicate device is a strategic decision as well. If you are going to go through a Class 2 clarification, you want to, and you have limited capital, right, when you're in a startup company, and your goal is how do I reduce the risk in getting my product to market in a timely and cost-effective manner, you want to look through all the predicates that you're going to be competing against. And you can get their files that they submitted to the FDA, you look at what their claims were in their files, what did the FDA approve them on, and you also take a look at did they do a large clinical trial. If they did a 500-patient clinical trial and you don't have the budget to do that, look for another predicate that's close to what you're thinking about with your device, and you might want to build your strategy around that. VentureMed elected to choose a predicate device that did not have a huge clinical on the front end, and as a result, when we took it to the FDA and sat down with them and we showed them how we compared to the performance of that device, they really weren't in a position to come back to us and say, yeah, but they did 200 people, you got to go out and do 250 people. Now, we had done a first-in-man trial, we had plenty of human clinical data, but that allowed us to create a plan around the timeline and the budget that we needed to support this. And one of the best ways to do that, again, is to get a matrix in place and look at what your competition has done. And then you have to identify all the applicable standards to your product, the guidance documents, and I'll just say one quick thing. In the catheter space, in the peripheral catheter space, there are some real nuances to the performance the FDA expects to see from that. One of them is that you have to be able to wrap your catheter around a half an inch tube and show when that tube's going to kink. Now, you're never going to see that anatomy in a person. One of the things that we could have gone, if we didn't understand what the guidance document said, could have shown up at the FDA and not had that information, in which case we'd be back to the drawing board. The easiest part of the 5-step is to prepare and submit a 510K application. And there's just volumes of information that go behind that. I say that tongue-in-cheek, but that really is a process where you're bringing in all of your engineering information, you're bringing all your test information, your clinical data, et cetera, and you're putting it in a electronic folder for the FDA to review. And then finally, you have to prepare for clearance and then registering your product. And I say prepare for clearance because in VentureMed's case, we We had actually received CE mark first, and we had decided to invest our energy and our funds in starting to build out the European market, thinking that our timeline with the FDA was going to be a longer timeline than it actually was. It was about 120 days. And we were planning on 180 days, so it came to us about 60 days earlier than we had planned. And boom, all of a sudden we have 510K clearance, and we weren't really ready to launch in the US. So it was a matter of readjusting our operating plan at that time, getting our salespeople back over from Europe and focused on working right here in our backyard. So those are the 5 easy steps.
Easy. You know what though, I hear is a theme in every single panel that we do is engage the experts early, because it's going to save you time in the back end. So I'm hearing that here too, most certainly. I'm guessing most of us would not be able to do this on our own, right? We would need to engage a firm or an expert. Are there certain firms that do this as part of what they do? I mean, this is something NAMSA, I know we are actually kicking into a question of later, but I think it fits right now. So is this something that NAMSA does?
Yeah, we do. So we have regulatory consultation services, and we work with all types of companies, from small startup companies, including one-man bands, like literally one person with an idea, all the way to large corporations who need to supplement their regulatory staff themselves. So one thing we would do first is what we call a regulatory assessment, and we say, okay, this is your idea, this is your technology. This is your patient population and what you intend for it to do. How can you expect to be regulated? And what are the FDA requirements associated with that? So FDA actually has some guidance documents and things like that, or standards that they would expect you to follow, and we can help identify those. We can also help in strategy, so helping companies choose a pathway. Gary has a platform technology. With some platform technologies and indication, you may have one indication which takes you down a class 2 route. You may have another indication that takes you down a class 3 route, and there's a multiple year, potentially multi-million-dollar difference between those two pathways, right? So sometimes folks like to start with the easier one first, and get their bearings, and then proceed. So we help with those kind of decisions.
Very good, thank you. Excellent. Okay, Paul. As director for UT Center for Drug Design and Development, you surely have a strong understanding of what it takes to bring a new pharmaceutical to the market, which is a little different than what we've been talking about. So can you give us an overview of that, please?
Sure. It's different, but there's many similarities. So to get into your clinical studies, you really need to submit an investigation of new drug application. And if you think you're going to and that's a plan for your clinical studies that you're proposing to the FDA. If you think, and they have to approve that for you to do your clinical studies. If you think you're going to talk to the FDA at that point, it's way too late. So we've heard about engaging expertise. An IND typically is about an aggressive plan, an aggressive Gantt chart might be able to accomplish the studies needed to put that together in 2 years. 2 to 3 years. That's an aggressive plan. You should be talking to the FDA at the outset of that plan. Where does that plan start? With small molecules. You have your lead compound that you think you want to take into a therapeutic mode in a certain population of patients. Now comes the 2 years of study to groom your IND to convince the FDA this is worthwhile at least to do clinical testing. Okay, just that much. Talk to the FDA at that point in time, right as you enter into this, because what you will be submitting to them can be better parallel to what their expectations are. Why do you need to talk to them? You can't just go to a website in this case, because the different subdivisions will have their own blend of what they think is needed for the clinical study. So in small company, where I was at once here, we didn't want to demonstrate our naivety by getting to the FDA and asking questions that demonstrated our naivety. So before you do that, you need to make sure you've got clinical consultants, that clinical research type physicians that work with those patient populations. So you've got this engaging of expertise just to plan the studies that are going to go forward for the next couple to 3 years to submit your IND document. What's happening during that time? You've heard about some of this. Demonstration of efficacy in models of the human patient population at 3 different tiers, starting with rodents, larger mammals, and then larger mammals. We're talking a human drug here eventually. That will dictate that patient population you will study, of course, from an efficacy point of view, but that's going to come in a little later phase of clinical study. The main thing you're doing in the IND is demonstrating safety. Okay? The efficacy will feed into the label, the labeling you'll get for your product eventually. But the FDA's concern foremost is safety. They have kind of a tacit assumption that you wouldn't put the money into something that you couldn't sell. So the efficacy is kind of assumed. You have to demonstrate it. You have to make sure everything is lined up that way, and your label gets to be what you want it is. But the real emphasis is on safety. Can it be used safely? They think the FDA's position would be that an entity out there might not look at that as seriously as their excitement over the efficacy. So there's a tremendous push on safety. What do I mean by tremendous push? It means, is your compound, your testing, the chemical quality control on that, going to really tell us if there's some element that's there in small amounts that might cause toxicity later? Literally, you have to prove the null hypothesis for the quality of your chemical compound before you can write up the data from toxicity studies that are going to be convincing. Okay, so it tumbles back. So you need good chemical quality control from the outset. You've engaged some discussion with experts in the FDA about a course of studies, but there will be some that are very general for all classes of therapeutics. I went through the species, getting to larger and larger mammals. You can do a lot of this if you're a really small company, piecemeal here and there, as long as your chemical quality is maintained. In each company you approach to do a certain type of toxicity study, pharmacology, gene testing. Different companies are specialized for you to do these things, and you've got the compound quality control in hand. You can spread them out. In other words, you don't have to umbrella everything under your own view. Of course, you have to supervise that. You're going to eventually generate this IND document. You will need writers for that to put that in the proper protocols for the FDA to look at. It's like submitting a patent. All of us have the right to submit our own patents for our own inventions. But you're kind of foolish to try to do that because the dialogue with the patent office is very specific in what they want to look at. They want that put in a certain format. Do the same thing with your IND submission. Don't try to write that yourself based on internet suggestions. Engage somebody that has the expertise in that. So now you're into this for 2 years. You submit an IND. You've established efficacy in animal models of the patient population you want. You've gone through the traditional toxicity. You've looked at toxicity unique to your particular product or compound. And you've built that into your studies for longer-term toxicity that has to precede clinical testing. Up to this point in time, you do not have to have a GMP-produced chemical raw drug, okay? You do have to have good quality control on it, but you don't have to have a GMP manufacturer, accepted manufacturer that requires inspection from the FDA to produce this material. You've probably gone up, just because of the numbers of studies you've done, somewhere between 500 grams and a kilogram. At that point, you've got a plan in place. You have some manufacturing processes that you also have to include in your IND. You need to get not an expert with a GMP chemical manufacturing company. You can Transition your technology that you might have for preparing the compound. It's analytical methods, and that's all very useful to this other company that will have a GMP-approved facility. That needs then to become part of the manufacturing, chemical manufacturing portion of the IND. So the IND will have that chemical manufacturing portion, the quality control, the efficacy, and the safety. You need to initiate clinical studies in large mammals, toxicity studies in large mammals that are running at least 2 weeks in advance of your longest exposure to humans. I'm saying this because you don't, so the really long-term toxicity, which NAMSA is kind of, that's what I've always thought you guys know for longer-term toxicity with devices, can precede the clinical test. You can begin that clinical test. You've submitted your IND, you have preliminary toxicity data, you've got it in mammals at least a couple of weeks ahead of your plan. You could submit that, and you have the rest of your toxicity plan in place as well, always preceding the actual clinical study. So your first, let's say you get your IND approved, okay? Now you can enter into a clinical study. You need the GMP manufactured material, and you need that GMP manufactured material for the longer term toxicity studies, okay? The first exposure in humans, it depends on the type of compound class you're in, but the first exposure, again, is safety. And they take healthy volunteers, because the healthy people are the best to fight off toxicity should it arise. Better adapt, better prepared to deal with unexpected toxicity. You may have some biomarkers, either for efficacy that you're going to have eventually in the patient population, that you can tweak out with your normal population. That's the ideal way to do this is a phase 1 clinical study for safety with a biomarker attached to it for efficacy. Okay? You may have biomarkers for the toxicity that you've established in that preceding 2-year to 3-year span. These are the markers you're going to look for when you're doing your safety testing and initial dose ranging in healthy volunteers. Through clinical studies, that may be only a few months long. You'll then, that's looking safe. You have some dose range to follow. You've got some preliminary pharmacokinetic data that's clinically based now, associated with this. You can move into a phase 2 study. Phase 2 studies in humans become much more elaborate with patient choice populations, healthy volunteers. And now you're going to begin to demonstrate some efficacious properties. At this point, your toxicity would have preceded this in terms of duration in the larger mammals. And you would have begun to work on a formulation that is compatible with your eventual product that you receive. So you're probably into this phase 2 study for at least 1 year to 2 years. And then it comes, and if that's successful, you go into phase 3, which is even larger populations. If you were to look at the cost, at the initial drug discovery, it's nothing actually. The preclinical development work, maybe $1 million, you can associate with some academic houses to get some of this done, and you're piecemealing it out. You'll do your own preliminary toxicity testing before you give it to a big house to do the studies. The dose ranging is there. You need that anyway because you don't know how much compound to make. You have to demonstrate toxicity. It's again the null hypothesis. You've got to push things till you see something. So the cost is $1 million or more for that. But when you get to the clinical studies, it's just going to zoom, okay? Just zoom. So by the time you're done, depending on what kind of estimate you want, because you can get estimates for people that seem to have bias for the government, the consumer, or the companies. And you can imagine the government thinks it doesn't cost that much. Companies are claiming it costs more than $1 billion a year. Somewhere in between some of these figures is probably the best one to go. But it's very costly, and it becomes up to, can easily be 10 to 15 years by the time you've got this compound you think is going to do something in humans, and you actually are done with your clinical testing. Now you put together a new drug application. If the IND was about 10 to 15 feet in height of documents, not electronic, going way back to when I discovered a drug 40 years ago, that was a 15-foot high stack, the IND. Then the NDA would probably be 30 to 40 feet high. Okay? So there's a lot of data that goes into this. Again, you need a professional writer just to put that together. Your average scientist in a company or in an academic setting can do the experiments well, but then that data and the write-up for that needs to be handed to somebody like you would a patent agent or a patent attorney would submit your patent.
Is that something that every drug goes through then? Is that entire long process, or is that just?
These are averages. It depends on the type of therapeutic class. You can get a fast track, which you really put together the same scheme, but because it's a unmet clinical need, medical need, the FDA may choose to bring that out for you sooner.
Okay.
It's really not a choice that you can make.
Okay.
NDA needs approval. That can take over a year. Just to look at your 30-foot tall stack of documents. It can take over a year. Fast track would be very quick. They're looking at this because it's an unmet patient population. And they're looking at this as it's occurring.
So if you're in drug development, expect it to be kind of a longer timeline, most definitely than a medical device. Would that be?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yes.
And much more complicated. Thank you, by the way, for sharing that valuable knowledge.
Because it's a challenge for funding this.
Yeah.
Our whole state of Ohio has not bought into this kind of funding process for small molecules and therapeutics. So my story to that is that don't look at it that way. The ideal point to make a technology transfer is with a phase 1 clinical study accomplished where you have demonstrated safety, and if you have a biomarker for efficacy, you've got dynamite. Because everybody coming to that table knows what they've got, knows where to go.
Yeah.
So most of the startups here, if they're thinking of small molecules, get to a phase 1 clinical study and then hand that off to big pharma.
Yeah.
That's the ideal time to do it.
Gotcha.
For academics, we can't get it into clinical studies half the time. We need small pharma to step in during the preclinical IND stage.
Okay.
Those are the ideal places. You don't have to look at it as such a horrible situation.
Sure. Well, thank you.
But the state has not bought into it.
Yeah.
They still like the devices.
Yeah. Well, they seem simpler, don't they? But
Well, they're just
they're
quicker to the market.
quicker to market, but equally important.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a pacemaker. Better than
Okay.
any drug I
But you know,
ever had.
building,
Well, hey, right, it goes both ways.
you're
Sorry.
building value in each phase, you know, from
Sure.
these
Yes.
early small molecule discovery to phase 1 data, phase 2 data, and the value of the enterprise or that information
Yeah.
is sellable. I mean, you don't need to think about taking a drug from molecule discovery all the way to market. There are
Right.
several exit points along.
You really need to partner.
Right, and of course, the farther along, the more valuable the company, and the more likely Pfizer or somebody else will want to buy it.
Exactly.
Good. That's a good point to make. So Carla, we have actually touched on a lot of your questions, but I will go ahead and actually formally ask it in
Okay.
case there's anything that we want to keep adding or anybody else wants to add. So can a startup company engage with the FDA early in their development process, and should they? If so, when should they do that and how? And can you tell us about that and touch on how NAMSA can help? So we did touch on a lot of that, but if you want to just kind
that's
of
okay.
go over it.
Yeah, sure. No, maybe I can talk a little bit about exactly how to do that. I mean,
Perfect.
Number one, generally speaking, I would highly recommend that, especially for groups that don't have a lot of comfort around the regulatory requirements and things like that. The mechanism to do that is you submit a request for what's called a pre-submission meeting. So you put a package to the FDA that tells them what your device is, what it's intended to do, what the patient population is, where it will be utilized, all those details. They also like to understand the clinical context, so what other therapeutic options are out there available in patients, what does the scope look like. And you also, the most important part is you put your testing plan in there. This is what we intend to do to demonstrate safety and effectiveness of our device. So that will include your bench testing, any animal studies if necessary, and potentially clinical. You can put together your whole plan and you can get their feedback on it. And the absolutely best part about it is that it's free. It actually doesn't cost anything to submit a pre-submission, and you get their feedback back on what they think about your plan. So I think it's an amazing thing that they offer for free. They've been very good, especially certain groups lately, in giving some very thorough advice, which I think is really helpful. I do think that there is an optimal time to do this though, right? So you don't want to submit this package when you've already done all your really expensive testing, like your animal studies or your MRI testing. There's some things that take some time and are costly, right? Because they don't agree how you did it, guess what, you're doing it over. So I think the optimal time to go in is when you know exactly what you want to do. You have to have a very specific indication. You can't say we're thinking about these 5 indications. You have to pick one. You would be very specific. If you have some early proof of concept work that's complete and you can show some results that demonstrate your device can do what you're saying it's going to do, that makes it less theoretical to them. And if you have some early safety work, so maybe you've done an animal study to test out your product to see how it works, and you've gotten some reasonable data out of that, that's also good to submit. So I highly recommend it. Like I said, generally speaking, and I think there is an optimal time. It takes 75 days to schedule that meeting, so that's not an insignificant amount of time. So you want to, boil that into your project planning and pick your timing and plan, appropriately, but it can be of enormous value. So.
Okay, and then if the meeting doesn't go well, will they do it again for free? Will they, if you tweak? Okay, good.
You can submit as many pre-submissions as you want, I think.
On the same idea?
On the same idea, yeah, you can keep talking about it.
That's great.
Yeah.
Know that they're open to that communication.
Yeah, they encourage, well, they ask you to come early and often. There is a flip side to this, like, you don't always want to give them everything necessarily. The more you give, the more that they sort of ask for. So there is some strategy about.
They never forget what you shared with them.
They never forget what you shared with them. So, if you're concerned that they could potentially push you in a direction that you don't want to go, I would definitely recommend having help putting together a package that will put you in the direction that you want to go, because there's lots of gray in the regulatory world. There's lots of opportunity for interpretation, and the way that you position your device and your information can be important. So.
Yeah, good. All right, thank you.
I just add to that, if I could, Jessica, the FDA is not quite the mysterious organization that it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I mean, their standards for processing applications has changed significantly. And I say even in the last 5 years. And that, as Carla said, this is it's a 75-day window on a pre-submission to when you're going to talk. You can see that on the website. You know that that's your time frame. Build that into your plan. When you submit an application, they are required by law to respond in 90 days. Right? Is that right? So you can build.
75 now.
Is it 75?
Yeah.
Okay. So even from 3 years ago when we submitted ours, it's shortened down to 75 days. Now, and you should build in your plan, and they probably won't respond until 74.
Right.
And just before midnight, but that's because they're going through a lot of information in order to be able to come back to you with a bunch of questions. And then the clock starts again when you respond to the questions, et cetera. So it's not like it's this amorphous thing you have to deal with. And I think one thing that's really important, if you're trying to raise capital at the same time you're going through these processes, you need to understand that and show that in your use of funds and your timeline, because nothing turns an investor off quicker than you saying, I don't know when the FDA is going to clear this, I have no idea. You can build that in and say, it should be cleared at this point.
Yeah, or not be realistic about the costs.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good, thank you. So your second question was about the fact that, you know, the FDA being US-based, right? You talked about the fact that you guys got your CE mark first. Could you just briefly touch on, you know, what is CE mark and how did that work for you?
So CE mark is changing. There's a new reg out that will be in place, I think, in 2019. So
Okay.
that reg is going to change significantly. And I will say the CE mark is based around quality to manufacture the product and to deliver a safe product. So you're demonstrating to the European authorities that you have a safe product. They're not so focused on efficacy, as the FDA is becoming more and more focused on efficacy. But the new standards that are rolling out are going to definitely create a much more FDA-like process for the EU than CE mark. So for us to prepare for CE mark, we had to build a quality system within VentureMed.
Yep.
And then we had to validate the quality system, and we engaged a third party. British Standards was the notified body that we engaged. And then you need to find an authorized representative in the countries that you're going to market your product, and that's another outside resource. We brought in a company from Munster, Germany to be our authorized representative. And they're really serving as our platform in Europe, that if we have any product complaints, if there's a failure, death as a result of using the product, anything along those lines, they are the ones who are responsible for reporting that to European authorities and then bringing that back to the company's attention.
Okay, interesting. It's interesting the little bit different focus there.
You know what, for years now, it has been a lower hurdle to get into the European marketplace. I think that hurdle is going to level off here pretty soon.
Okay.
Within the next 12 to 24 months.
Will there be anything that you'll have to do if you already have a CE mark? Will you have to file new paperwork or show any new?
We will not have to file new paperwork, but there'll be an increased level of scrutiny around our quality system, and we'll bring forward an audit from our notified body.
Okay.
To make sure that the data that we have on hand. There is one addition that we will have is the collection. When you have a medical device in the marketplace, we're constantly collecting input from our customers. And this is voluntary input initially, so this is registry information, it's user information, etc. As we've collected that, and we've got over 1,000 patient experiences now, that data will be something that we share then with the EU in order to support the efficacy of the platform.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is our final question, and then we're getting close to one. We'll have a couple minutes left if anybody has any other questions that we haven't asked here. This is for Paul. So clearly you have a lot of experience in drug development and the FDA in general. So any overall, I know you shared a lot with us, but do you have any other overall tips for success or pitfalls to avoid?
I'll keep this shorter, and I'll pick up on the international interactions because that's very important. It's been pointed out. It's a little different with drugs. The European system, and there's trying to keep it short. There is an ongoing effort to harmonize clinical studies globally.
Yeah.
That hasn't arrived yet for pharmaceuticals.
Okay.
But historically and still today, the Europeans, their IND requirement is a little different. So a physician's discretion can actually look at new compounds historically, and if they're interested, they can try them in patients. No, you can't do that here. So you have to have your IND to have a very regulated clinical study. So just to give you an example, even with this drug that I invented, we didn't have an IND. Our venture funding wanted to have patients' data quickly. So I had to go to Canada to do the manufacturing. Because without an IND, you also cannot manufacture a drug in the United States to be used elsewhere in the world. So you need that just to manufacture the drug, let alone to put it into U.S. citizens. So we lined up patients in Germany. I went to Canada to do the synthesis. We did the formulation in France. And the clinical studies turned out to be so impressive, we then reincorporated them back into our IND, which is very pleasant to see that the FDA was very glad to see those. But in the meantime, the venture people were happy, and the financing was there, and the clinical path had really been set at that point. So the international interactions are very important. It is a little different with drugs versus devices.
Is that something that occurs frequently, that people take
Big
that action?
Big Pharma has done this a long time.
Yeah.
I'm not sure all the little pharma take advantage of it, at least in that one.
Do you think it's because they aren't aware that that's a pathway, or just that it's more expensive, or?
No, it's not necessarily more expensive. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Good. Curiosity. Anything to add to that?
Well, it's quicker information, I think, is one of the things that's key for an early stage company, right? Is that if I can get real live patient information,
Yeah.
especially from a pharmaceutical, but even for us as a device company, we chose to go to Europe to get our first in-human data
Yeah.
because we could establish CE mark and ISO certification in our own facility, and that gives us the hall pass then to find sponsors in Europe. And we worked with NAMSA. NAMSA was a key partner in our first demand study in Poland. And with 14 patients worth of data to bring that back then to the FDA was quite substantial and moved our project along much quicker than we could have if we had taken the same path in the US.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much. I know that's a lot of really helpful information. Thank you. I know I learned a lot. Do we have any other questions? Anybody, kind of something that we maybe didn't touch on? Yes.
My question, I guess, would be more for Paul.
Sure.
It would be like the pathway that I would need to take to bring it over the counter to market.
Ooh.
Wow, good question. I'm not sure I can answer that. I've spent my entire life with ethical pharmaceuticals, although I lecture to the students on NSAIDs.
And I'm thinking I would fall under the Cosmetic Act somehow.
Yeah.
And as far as being like you with legend drugs, I wouldn't have that stringent.
I would hate to misadvise you and say that, because over the counter, if you think about it, it's a bigger exposure. It's less regulated at the level of the pharmacy. So, I mean, if I was the FDA, I'd be at least as concerned about an over-the-counter as I would. But then look at all the natural products.
Yeah.
Oh,
But does the FDA regulate all of that?
No,
Because
they
I
do
see
not.
that a lot of
The
the.
natural products are very poorly regulated.
Yeah.
I talked about chemical quality control at the very least. These things are mixtures of things that are poorly defined. But an over-the-counter, a decent over-the-counter drug, is going to hit a lot of patients. I mean, a lot of consumers.
That's my question as
And
far as...
I'm hesitant to say there's any less restriction because of the labeling that you're going to get on that. It's not a natural product, that's different. So the FDA is still going to have to do some kind of labeling for you on that. You have to have safety.
And it's a matter of substantial equivalence to a claim that's already there, I would imagine, if it's an NSAID or...
If it's an NSAID,
pain
yes, but if it's
matter.
a new over-the-counter of some type, what
But
is the
essentially,
carrot?
it's a topical. And there's nothing in this topical that isn't in the market already.
Oh, yeah, but topicals, that's the whole thing with devices. I mean, I think they spend half their time chasing around what might be coming off the device into a human. I mean, I don't mean to, but I think.
That does
part of it.
that does get into the hybrid of a drug
Yeah.
device. Is it a drug delivery system? Is the topical delivery system itself?
Or even the polymers for it.
Yeah.
A barrier.
Yeah. So a topical, well, if you could go the route of a cosmetic,
See,
that's not what you
not
want.
easy to. Did you have anything to add, Lisa?
Therapeutic.
I was just going to say somehow the way they determine who's kind of regulated is what they consider the primary mode of action. I don't know enough about it, but if the primary mode of action is your drug, the drug center will be kind of responsible for that. If it's some kind of physical barrier, and that's actually the primary mode of action, the drug is an additive to that, then the devices center ends up being responsible for that. So just a watch out. But,
What is your
and
drug, and what is your drug supposed to, or your topical supposed to be doing?
Well, it's a barrier, and it's targeted to incontinence market, which is more like the diaper rash barrier for to be used with diapers.
It sounds like a device.
You have to do an assessment.
Yeah, maybe you guys could get connected offline.
If you could get
Yeah.
into the device mode,
Yeah.
much better.
But this is why it's so important though, to like bring the expertise forward and get people connected, because,
Yeah,
you know.
I will say one other thing, the new molecular entities are the ones that really makes like their hair stand on end and things get more rigorous. If you can use existing molecular entities, I think that's generally a little bit easier for them to manage.
Makes sense. It's a good question though. Sure.
Hopefully this is a more straightforward question. For your device guys, what strategy would you recommend for a company that small? I have a two-person company. We develop novel devices. But I know each step along the way of that development, the FDA requires product design review, design control stuff. How do you protect intellectual property without, you're getting people to give you feedback on your device?
Well, clearly the standards with working with a company like NAMSA are extremely high, and you put in place an NDA like you would with any of your suppliers that are potentially going to provide you product. If you're disclosing your secret sauce, then get an NDA in place and a disclosure agreement in place with anybody initially. It's so important for you. Are you planning on taking your products all the way to market, or are you just doing certain development for another client?
Yeah, we're going market.
And I think this is another reason to get, I think NAMSA is an excellent resource for this as well, is to get an assessment done on the front end. Put an NDA in place with them. They'll assign someone to you that has experience in your general space, whether it's peripheral arterial disease or coronary disease or orthopedics, etc. And then you'll share with them who you think you're going to compete against, what technologies do you think you're going to displace, and let them help you build the roadmap. But until a few months ago, VMG or VentureMed was only a couple-person company as well, and we outsourced the writing of our 510K application. We hired people as consultants and contractors, and you can go to firms. NAMSA's resources there. Emergo is another excellent resource in the U.S. Or you can go to individuals. Ex-FDA people oftentimes put up a shingle and become great consultants as standalones. But I think that's it's not something that you can do alone, or should try to do alone. It's a lot of work. In your design history, because you're a medical device company, you have to comply with the design history file recorded. So in other words, the FDA is going to want to look at every decision you made. If you chose a polymer, you chose it for this reason, and what was the data that you backed that up with? You chose this metal, what was the reason you backed that up with? Halfway through, you changed your mind to go somewhere else. Why did you change your mind? Because that's all discoverable information if you have a failure several years out and they're wondering why did the pacemaker stop beating and cause injury to the patient.
So I think there's even more. I mean, it pays to invest up front.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Even though I know it is an expense for a startup, but I think it's one of those things that, especially in this game, you really have to get the experts involved early. So, well, we are past time, but I want to thank you all. This has been incredibly valuable, so thank you.